If you're seeing the words "Trump freezes Canada's dollar access" spreading online right now and thinking that can't be real, you're asking the correct question. Because if it's true, it isn't a tariff dispute anymore. It's economic war. Not with missiles, not with soldiers, with plumbing, the invisible infrastructure that moves dollars across the world, the stuff most people never think about until the moment it stops working. But here's the problem. In the last year, we've watched a wave of just now 1 minute ago political videos go viral with incredibly specific, incredibly dramatic claims that later turned out to be fabricated or AI manipulated. Some of those fake stories were literally built around Mark Carney, Trump, and a sudden North American economic shock, complete with invented protocols, invented walkouts, and invented market chaos. So today we're doing this the right way. I'm Dylan Sterling, and in the next few minutes I'm going to show you what we can confirm and what we cannot confirm about this dollar access freeze claim, what a real freeze would actually mean in US law and banking mechanics, what Carney's most realistic emergency countermoves would look like, and the 7 signals that will tell you in the next 72 hours whether this is just misinformation or the opening move of a financial confrontation the modern world almost never sees between allied countries. Because if the United States ever truly tried to cut Canada off from dollar clearing, the consequences would not stay in Ottawa. They would hit Detroit, they would hit Chicago, they would hit your gas price, your grocery bill, and your retirement account. So let's lock the facts down first. Here is what I can say clearly as of today, March 3, 2026. I have not found credible, mainstream wire confirmation, Reuters RTO, or an official US Treasury White House release stating Canada's access to US dollars is frozen, or that Canadian banks have been broadly sanctioned in a way that would effectively end their ability to clear dollars. What is confirmed is that the US-Canada relationship has been under escalating strain through tariffs and retaliation. Canada has imposed retaliatory tariffs in response to US steel and aluminum duties, and major outlets have covered the back-and-forth measures and the economic stakes. What is also confirmed is that Canadian officials are publicly planning for greater long-term trade diversification away from the US, and the USMCA relationship is approaching its major 26 review, with warnings about persistent uncertainty. So what are we dealing with today? We are dealing with a high-impact claim that is currently moving faster than verification. And in 2026, that's not a minor detail, because we've already seen fact-checkers document a pattern. Dramatic Carney-Trump breaking news clips presented as authentic, sometimes even made to look like established commentators, later rated fake and traced to manipulation. So this episode is a rumor watch episode, but with real receipts on how the system works. Now let's do the competitor-style structure. 3 announcements, not 3 announcements from governments, 3 realities the internet is forcing on you right now. When people say freeze a country's dollar access, they're usually describing one of 2 things. Option A, direct sanctions, flocking actions. In US sanctions practice, blocking is basically freezing. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, defines blocking as freezing assets and imposing a broad prohibition on transfers or dealings with the blocked property. So if the US were to freeze major Canadian financial institutions or Canada's central bank using sanctions authorities, it could force US persons and institutions to stop dealing with them in the normal way. That's the legal concept. Option B, cutting institutions off from the US financial system. OFAC's own guidance explains that from a practical standpoint, sanctions can mean being cut off from the US commercial and financial systems. And here's why that phrase is terrifying. Because the US financial system is where the dollar lives operationally, not as a symbol, as rails. If you're a bank outside the US and you need to settle dollars, the global system routes you directly or indirectly through US-connected mechanisms and counterparties. Now let's talk about the plumbing in plain English. One of the major private sector US dollar clearing and settlement systems is CHIPS, which the clearinghouse describes as the largest private sector USD clearing and settlement system, clearing and settling enormous value each day, and acting as the private sector counterpart to Fedwire. So when you hear the phrase freeze dollar access, what people are really implying is make it legally or operationally impossible for Canadian banks to settle in USD through the dominant networks. That is not a tariff. That is a systemic move, and it would be so extraordinary between allied economies that it would require unmistakable official footprints, Treasury designations, regulatory guidance, bank compliance actions, and immediate international coverage, which brings us to the most important sentence of the day. If this really happened, you wouldn't be hearing it first from a random Just Now clip. You'd be hearing it from the US Treasury, the major wires, and your bank. So why is it spreading anyway? Because dollar freeze is the perfect viral narrative. It sounds sophisticated, it sounds catastrophic, and most people don't know how to verify it. Now let's move to announcement #2, because even the hint of something like this forces countermoves. If there were a sudden shock to Canada's access to USD funding markets, Canada wouldn't respond first with a mic drop speech. Canada would respond with liquidity architecture. Here's what that means. Countermove #1, swap lines and central bank backstops. The Federal Reserve explicitly states that the Fed and several major central banks, including the Bank of Canada, maintain standing US dollar liquidity swap line arrangements to enhance the provision of US dollar liquidity and ease strains in global funding markets. That matters because in stress events, swap lines are one way to prevent the entire funding market from seizing up. Now, I'm not saying Canada would just pull dollars from the Fed and everything is fine. I'm saying these backstops exist precisely because modern financial crises spread through dollar liquidity. And Canada has domestic tools too. A Federal Reserve research note summarizing liquidity facilities describes Bank of Canada tools such as a standing liquidity facility and emergency lending, assistance mechanisms intended to support orderly settlement and provide liquidity support. And the Bank of Canada has explicitly analyzed how a severe trade war and tariff uncertainty can stress the Canadian economy and financial system, highlighting recession scenarios, defaults, and pressure on banks. So if there were any true systemic dollar shock, the immediate Canadian response would look like liquidity facilities, coordinated statements to stop bank runs, and quiet surgical stabilization. Countermove #2, accelerate trade and settlement diversification. This is already happening at the strategic level. AP has reported on Carney's push to diversify Canada's trade away from the US, including outreach to major partners like India, and framing it as resilience amid US pressure. The Financial Times also describes Carney pursuing expanded trade relationships, consistent with a broader diversification strategy, and AP reports Canadian officials warning that the USMCA could face repeated reviews, creating persistent uncertainty, again pushing Canada to reduce single market dependence. So if you're looking for the Carney countermove, it won't be one signature on one dramatic document. It will be new corridors, new settlement practices, new redundancy, because in the 21st century, power isn't only size, power is options. Now announcement #3 is where this becomes painfully real for everyday people, because the moment dollar freeze becomes thinkable, markets and businesses act. Even if it's rumor, let's say you run a manufacturing business in Ontario that sells components into Michigan, or you run a US firm that buys Canadian inputs, or you're an energy trader pricing North American flows. If you hear credible chatter that Canadian banks might face restrictions in USD settlement, you don't wait for confirmation. You do 3 things. You pull forward cash, you shorten payment terms, you start looking for alternate counterparties, and that is how rumor becomes damage. Now bring it back to what we actually know. We already have a documented environment of tariff uncertainty and retaliation, with Canada and the EU retaliating against US steel and aluminum tariffs, and broad warnings that businesses will pass costs to consumers. We have the Bank of Canada explicitly warning that tariff volatility and a long-lasting trade war could trigger severe economic consequences, including recession scenarios and credit stress. So the system is already taut. In a taut system, a dollar freeze rumor is like throwing a match into dry grass, which brings us to the most important practical question: who benefits from spreading a story like this if it isn't true? Sometimes it's click farms, sometimes it's political persuasion, sometimes it's financial manipulation, and sometimes it's simply the new reality. AI-assisted news theater channels that can manufacture extremely specific economic storylines that sound plausible to the untrained ear. And we know this genre exists because it has been documented. The Yahoo/Snopes style fact-check on a similar Carney-Trump 1 minute ago narrative found no credible evidence and concluded the video was fabricated, with telltale signs of AI manipulation and a channel pattern of repetitive sensational titles. So here's the Dylan Sterling principle. A story this big needs footprints. If you can't find the footprints, treat it as performance, not reality. Now let's talk about what would have to happen next if this were real, or if it becomes politically useful for either side to pretend it's real. In the US, the incentive is obvious. If you're in a trade confrontation and you want leverage, you threaten escalation. You use words like national security. You signal you can go beyond tariffs. In Canada, the incentive is also obvious. If you want to prove sovereignty and resilience, you signal you have options, new trade partners, new corridors, new leverage. But the most dangerous incentive is the one in the middle, media ecosystems that profit from catastrophe framing. This is why these just now claims are so viral. They compress complexity into a clean morality play. Villain flips a switch, hero signs a countermove, world changes overnight. Reality is slower. Reality is memos, compliance bulletins, liquidity facilities and phone calls between central banks. And if you want to be the channel that wins long-term, you have to be the one that can tell a thrilling story without lying. Now let's get practical. I'm going to give you the 7 signals you should watch in the next 24-72 hours. Because if this claim is false, those signals will stay quiet. And if it's true, or becoming true, those signals will scream. Signal 1. A US Treasury, OFAC action with names real freezes require designations, directives or prohibitions with identifiable legal hooks. OFAC's own definitions make clear what blocked property means and how prohibitions operate. Signal 2. Major banks changing behavior publicly. If big Canadian banks suddenly can't clear USD normally, you'll see official bank statements, investor disclosures, and immediate coverage by mainstream business outlets. Signal 3. A spike in settlement friction, trade finance chatter. This shows up as letters of credit issues, invoice disputes, shortened terms and supply chain delays. Signal 4. A Canadian central bank stability posture. You'd expect expanded liquidity messaging, stabilization statements, or explicit references to USD funding stress. Canada has a known framework for liquidity support. Signal 5. G7 diplomatic coordination between allied economies. A move like this would trigger immediate alignment efforts because the precedent is dangerous. Signal 6. USMCA 2026 review rhetoric hardening. AP reports Canadian officials already raising concern about repeated reviews and uncertainty after the 2026 review clause. If money access becomes part of the fight, that rhetoric escalates. Signal 7. The deepfake ecosystem feeding follow-on clips. If you see 10 more videos with identical templates, identical phrasing, and invented protocols, you are likely watching the same machine that fact-checkers already documented. Now let's do what your competitor does. Bring it home to the viewer. If this is only a rumor, your immediate risk is psychological, panic decisions, doom scrolling, and misinformation-induced stress. But if this becomes policy, even partially, the effects are real. If you live in a border state economy tied to autos, manufacturing, energy or agriculture, trade finance friction hits jobs fast. If you have a 401k, volatility rises when North American trade gets repriced. If you run a business, your cost of capital and your payment terms can change overnight when counterparties lose confidence. This is why the US-Canada relationship is not just foreign policy, it's domestic life. Now, I'm going to end with the competitor-style fork. 2 paths. Path 1. This collapses as misinformation. The story fails the verification test. No Treasury action, no bank statements, no official confirmations. It fades, and the real conflict remains where it's been. Tariffs, retaliation, negotiation, and long-term diversification. Path 2. Financial measures enter the confrontation. Not a full Canada dollar cutoff that would be nuclear between allies, but targeted restrictions, targeted investigations, targeted national security hooks. And in that world, Canada's countermove won't be a single signature. It will be a long emergency program of liquidity, plus diversification, plus new corridors, exactly the direction Canada is already signaling. I'm Dylan Sterling. Drop your answer in the comments, but make it analytical. Do you think this dollar access freeze claim is 1, pure fabrication, 2, a trial balloon, or 3, a real policy being tested quietly? And if you want the next update when we can confirm footprints, subscribe, because if this ever becomes real, The first reliable signals won't come from a viral clip. They'll come from the plumbing,